You're listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm talking with Sandra Soto, Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona. She holds a PhD in English with a focus in ethnic and third world literature from the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of Reading Chicano, Chicana Like a Queer, The Demastery of Desire, published in 2010 by the University of Texas Press. Her interdisciplinary research and teaching interests are in Chicana, Chicano, and Latino, Latina literary and cultural studies, feminist theory, gender studies, and queer theory. She's a faculty affiliate of English, the Center for Latin American Studies, and Mexican American Studies. I've invited her to the show to discuss the charges brought against 3 students from the University of Arizona who were protesting a campus presentation by armed Border Patrol agents last month. The students are known as the Arizona 3. Welcome, Sandra, to Voces Críticas. On March 19, 2019, Border Patrol agents gave a presentation to a student club, the Criminal Justice Association, on your campus. Before we get into the aftermath of the incident with the students known as the Arizona 3, what about this invitation itself concerns you as a feminist teacher, as a mentor, and as a scholar of Chicano, Chicana, and Latino, Latina literary and cultural studies?
That's a great question. And I want to thank you, Silvana, for inviting me to speak to you today. To answer your question about my own relationship to the university as a professor here, I've been here since 2001, so about 18 years. And recently, the U.S. Department of Education designated the University of Arizona an HSI, a Hispanic Serving Institution, which means that at least 25% of our undergraduate students are Latinx, or what the U.S. DOE calls Hispanic. So that's one thing that I want to stress from the beginning, is that the university is currently really boasting this designation of being an HSI. There aren't many Research One institutions that have this designation. With this designation, HSI brings many opportunities for the university, financial largely. So in addition to being an HSI, meaning again that we have a large Latinx undergraduate population, we're just over 60 miles from Nogales. So we are definitely, in the U.S.-Mexico borderland. The presence of CBP, the Border Patrol, on our campus, therefore, is an urgent problem that we feel needs to be addressed immediately. The presence of Border Patrol, especially armed Border Patrol in uniform on our campus, is the disruption. And I want to point that out and foreground it right away. While the students, the Arizona 3, have been charged with creating disruption on March 19th, it's actually the Border Patrol who was creating disruption, just their very presence in the hallways of the Modern Languages building, which is where the Criminal Justice Association was having its event on the 19th. As an educator on this campus, this concerns me because many of my students are brown. I teach classes that are cross-listed with Mexican American Studies, where I have an affiliation. When you have this relationship to students, to brown students, when you are teaching at an HSI, you have a responsibility as the faculty member to create the conditions of an ideal learning environment that are non-threatening, that do not trigger or reproduce trauma. Many students on this campus are undocumented. Some of the students who are Latinx U.S. citizens have nonetheless experienced firsthand trauma at the hands of the BP because of the BP's treatment of family members, because of the BP's treatment of people living in this really charged U.S.-Mexico borderland zone that is witnessing daily firsthand the effects of families coming apart violently because of the CBP. The students who spoke out on the 19th should be understood under this larger context of what it means to have a visceral response to the guns, the green uniforms, the presence of CBP.
Now, the three students, Denise, Marielle, Mariana, they've been criminally charged for engaging in protest against the presence of the Border Patrol agents, of the armed Border Patrol agents. Are all three of them at this point facing Class 1 misdemeanors? And this can apparently result in a 6-month prison sentence.
Yes, that's correct. All three of them have been charged with a state law, an Arizona state law that is called interference with or disruption of an educational institution. In addition, one of the three students has received a second charge called threats and intimidation. So people from all over the country and even increasingly outside of the United States are demanding that all charges be dropped immediately. And the concern is not just for the well-being of these three students, although certainly that's our most immediate effort is to get the charges dropped. But we also don't want to allow the University of Arizona Police Department, the University of Arizona administration to create a precedent with these three cases, the Arizona three, that will for sure create a chilling effect on the university campus, right? About what it is that we can say, how we can say it, is it respectful enough? And so we're focusing on the Arizona three, but also really working to think about and research the larger political environment on and off of campuses. We're paying attention to Trump's executive order having to do with free speech on what he calls free speech on university campuses, by which he means he's wanting to protect a certain kind of speech. In this case, the case of March 19th, his executive order would apply to the right of Border Patrol to speak, right? And any disruption to that kind of free speech could receive punitive financial federal withholdings from a university.
And that might explain to some degree why your president has responded also in the way that he has, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But are you in touch with the students right now? And if you are, how are they holding up? How are they doing?
I am in touch with the students. Two of the students were charged at the same time. They were undergraduate students, or they are undergraduate students. And the third student was charged later. This is alarming to us. And when I say us in this interview, what I mean is the many, many people, both on and off campus, who are paying attention to what is happening and organizing actions, letter writing campaigns, etc., on behalf of the Arizona Three. The UAPD has been absolutely zealous in its investigations. They are continuing to investigate this. To go back to your original question, I am in touch with the students largely through a representative to the students. So I am kind of an ad hoc faculty rep to the students, and then there are a couple of ad hoc undergraduate students who haven't been charged, who I'm in touch with. So we pass messages to each other back and forth as a way to not overwhelm the three, because the three students, as you can imagine, are completely overwhelmed right now. And we're wanting to protect them. We're wanting to not just address the charges, the criminal charges, but we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that the dean of students supports them rather than investigates them. We want to make sure that the Dean of Students' office is in touch with their teachers and professors this semester to alert them to the fact that these three students might need some special accommodations given the situation.
And so the UAPD refers to the University of Arizona Police Department, is that right?
That's right, the University of Arizona Police Department.
So let's talk a little bit about the University of Arizona president, Robert Robbins, who has sided, of course, and I say of course because it seems to always happen, with the decision of the school's police chief to charge the students. What about this relationship concerns you? What about this response concerns you, that a university president would support the decision to charge students?
It's absolutely absolutely alarming that President Robbins has sided with UAPD. And it's absolutely alarming as well that President Robbins has met with high-level officials of the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol has gone on record on right-wing radio as being furious with the incident on the 19th. And I believe that President Robbins, I'm just speaking as myself now, I believe that President Robbins is concerned about the Border Patrol's relationship to the University of Arizona insofar as they're angry that their agents were treated in what they consider a disrespectful way. And so I believe that President Robbins is responding to pressure from the high-level members of the union of the Border Patrol. And so we have research teams, people who I'm working with are researching possible collusion between the UAPD, the Border Patrol, and President Robbins.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that investigation or that report and see what becomes clear to us after it's concluded. You're listening to Dr. Sandra Soto, Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona. She's talking about charges brought against 3 students from the University of Arizona who were protesting a campus presentation by armed Border Patrol agents last month. They are known as the Arizona 3. According to this letter from University of Arizona President Robbins, the protest represented, quote, a dramatic departure from our expectations of respectful behavior and support for free speech on this campus, end quote. The use of the word respectful is obviously intentional, and I wanted to know your thoughts about how this discourse of respectability has been used as a tool by the administration, for example, for undermining dissent and undermining protest.
I'm glad that you are bringing this to your listeners' attention, both the letter from U of A, President Robbins, as well as his strategic use of the word respectful. This is a problem here and, of course, elsewhere. The current use of charged words like respectful, civil, and we know, and we're keeping track of, the way that this language of respect and the discourse of civility is used unidirectionally, right? It's a language that is used to shame people who speak back to power. We are concerned with President Robbins' letters, in the plural, because he has written a couple now, to the university community. We also need to pay attention to the fact that all 3 students are women. The vice president of the union of the Border Patrol, of the CBP, actually went on right-wing radio and used this very discourse of civility in the most sexist way. He used this discourse of civility to shame or to attempt to shame one of the people who spoke out for not being a quote-unquote lady. So this language of civility is charged in interesting ways that we need to pay attention to from what we would call an intersectional perspective, the way that the discourse of civility is particularly used to shame people of color, to shame working class people, to shame women who step out of line.
I mean, so much of that discourse, Sandra, is about people in power feeling uncomfortable about what's being, put out there in this, not in an even provocative way, but just forthright way. And I think this discourse of respectability is imposed on the students. It's being imposed on faculty. It really is raising larger alarm bells, I think, around the precarity of academic freedom in this moment, because it is about silencing dissent. It is about silencing protest.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I want to point people's attention to one particularly moving letter. We've been receiving letters from all over the country that are addressed to President Robbins, but some of these letters have been shared with us, the organizers, especially with one group that I work with called the Coalition for the Arizona 3, a group that is largely constituted of progressive faculty and progressive graduate students And one of the people who reached out to me to share his letter with me is my colleague, Vincent Johnson, who is a faculty member in the Department of English, specifically in creative writing. He happened to have been teaching his class on the third floor of the Modern Languages building on the 19th when the CBP agents were creating the disruption. And he was one of the people who was contacted by UAPD for an interview. So I mentioned earlier that the UAPD has been absolutely zealous in their investigation. One of the ways that they have been really forceful is not just looking at photographs and video footage of the protests and trying to find these people who were involved. So, for instance, the third student was identified based on video footage, is my understanding. They're spending a lot of time on this. We need to pay attention to the fact that the UAPD has investigators working on this and continuing to work on this. I can't say too much about a possible fourth case now, but I do know that they are not stopping, that they are continuing in their investigation. This is really scary. The U of A is becoming a police state, if it isn't already. And one of the ways that they are doing this investigation, or one of their tools, is to contact the instructors and the professors who were teaching in classrooms adjacent to the CBP presentation and attempting to get those professors and those instructors to go on record as saying that their classes were disrupted by the Arizona 3, right?
Wow,
and so
wow.
I know of 3 people. 2 are graduate student instructors, and one is Vincent Johnson, who I just named. He's given me permission to use his name publicly, who have been contacted by the UAPD. Professor Johnson was interviewed for an hour by the lead investigator, who wanted him to go on record as saying that the Arizona 3 had disrupted his seminar that night. He said in response to these questions, it wasn't the Arizona 3 who disrupted my class. It was actually the Border Patrol who disrupted my ability to concentrate on teaching. What happened with Professor Johnson is he went out into the hallway to get a drink of water, and he saw in the hallway, this is what his letter says, he saw in the hallway armed Border Patrol. He, like any normal person would, assumed that the armed Border Patrol standing in the hallway of Modern Languages, that they were there to detain somebody, possibly one of his students. They were right outside of his classroom. He could not concentrate after that. He was in a panic. He went back into the room and was trying to remember what his rights were as an educator and what are his students' rights. Could he bar the door? Could he refuse them entry? And he could not get his attention back. At some point, he had to decide to end class early because he was so frightened. This is a white man, a white citizen, who's a professor, who has, some deal of power, who was freaked out by the visceral response of the Border Patrol in the hallway. He didn't understand at that moment that the Border Patrol were waiting to enter into this adjacent classroom to give this presentation. So even he had this response, this triggering visceral response to the Border Patrol, to these men in uniform with guns. And as he describes in his letter, and as he is saying very publicly, one of the reasons that he had this response was not just out of concern for his brown students in the classroom, who he wanted to protect, right? But I'm sorry, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult here because his letter also explains that he has a response to cops in uniforms because he's lived his life as an out gay man, and he has learned from that experience to distrust cops because of the historical relationship between cops and queer people, right? And the way that gays and lesbians have been criminalized. So at that moment, he just wanted to protect his students and didn't know how to.
I think that's what makes what's happening in Arizona so upsetting to the rest of us who also work in university institutions, because ultimately we understand power. We understand that particular bodies, departments, etc., represent power based on our own lived experiences. Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's so powerful.
Yeah. And I'm very appreciative of Fenton Johnson for writing his letter. Some form of it will be published soon, I believe, in the LA Times. But I wanted to add one more thing that goes back to collusion and that goes back to what I'm talking about in terms of just the sheer zealousness of the UAPD and all of this under Robin's watch, that not only did UAPD, a detective for UAPD, not only did the detective contact at least 3 people that I know of, possibly more, who were teaching their classes, the faculty advisor of the Criminal Justice Club, he is a former cop, and he's the faculty advisor for the student club. He contacted the graduate student advisor that I know of, that I've been in touch with, and pushed her to go on record as saying that her class had been disrupted. When you have a faculty member putting pressure, a former cop, and the faculty member who is the advisor for the student club, who has brought these agents onto campus and who, in fact, pressed charges against the Arizona 3, when you have that faculty member pressuring a graduate student instructor he's trying to conscript her, right? Trying to conscript her as a cop. That is unacceptable. That is unacceptable behavior. That is unacceptable pressure. That he reached out to her, that he went and found her email address and her name and wrote to her and pressured her, a Latina, by the way, is unacceptable to us.
I mean, I have chills hearing this story, Sandra, because, this is bullying behavior. Clearly, a faculty member has power over this graduate student instructor, and very disconcerting that that kind of pressure would be placed on a graduate student, making now this workplace so hostile.
Right. And so she needs our support, too, because she very clearly told this professor that she understood the right of protest, that she understood the right of these students to exercise their free speech. She needs our support for standing up for the Arizona 3 and for having to handle this professor and the UAPD on her own. The UAPD did contact her also, and that's, again, one of the 3 people that I know of who have been contacted by the UAPD.
I mean, that explains to some level why in one of the letters that UA President Robbins, he said, quote, protest is protected, but disruption is not. And I thought, what kind of protests have you been to? I mean, that is what protests do. I mean, I just thought to myself, what a fundamental misunderstanding and, a play with words to some degree, right? To try and, get support for the charges against the Arizona 3. And he's also claiming that he can't do anything for these students and that these charges are now completely out of his hands. Do you believe this? Is this a form of him kind of trying to not be accountable for what's happening to the students of his own campus?
Absolutely. We have to continue to hold him accountable until all of the charges have been dropped and until he agrees to create policy that prohibits Border Patrol and or ICE onto our campus. We won't stop until he does that. And the passing of the buck has been incredibly frustrating and not surprising. While it might be technically true that he, as an individual, no longer has the power or possibly never had the power to himself drop the charges, this happened on his watch. And so he needs to do what he needs to do to go outside of the university, right, and demand, he's not going to demand, but influence the court to drop the charges. He needs to do that. We are not going to back off of him until he does that, until the charges are dropped. We don't accept the passing of the buck at all. And we don't accept that rather than protecting the students, he allowed them to be criminalized that he participated in that criminalization under this discourse of civility and so-called respectful behavior, that on his watch he allowed armed border patrol to go into the Modern Languages building, that he met with the vice president of the Border Patrol Union rather than meeting with our students, rather than seeing what it is that the students, the Arizona 3, need. That on his watch, the UAPD continues this draconian focus and obsession with this March 19th event. Why is the UAPD so focused on this particular event? What is the relationship between the UAPD and the Border Patrol? Why is it that days after this incident, President Robbins allowed the vice president of the Border Patrol Union, a Trump supporter who has gone on, again, right-wing radio to shame the Arizona 3, who has gone on right-wing radio to say, oh, they want trigger warnings when Border Patrol comes to campus? All right, give me their home addresses and names of everybody who is undocumented, and I'll go and take care of it myself. With the right-wing radio host hearing that and laughing, making a veiled threat or not so veiled threat to go arrest people who are undocumented. This is who Robbins is friends with. This is unacceptable. This is hate speech. This is disruption. Del Cueto, the vice president of the Border Patrol, to allow him the same week to come onto our campus and speak to the college Republicans at their events. This collusion is unacceptable, and we are researching it, and we are not going to stop until we publicize it and until the charges are dropped. I call on especially tenured faculty. The reason that I can speak out as directly as I'm speaking out is because I have tenure, and that doesn't offer me complete protection, but the problem is when faculty who have tenure do not use their tenure to speak out on behalf of people who are more vulnerable, and I will continue to speak out.
Well, Sandra, I support you, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I think it's very, very selective the way that President Robbins is saying, I can't do anything about these students, but clearly forming these questionable alliances with the Border Patrol, UAPD, et cetera. So clearly there is some power, or else he would say nothing. But he's intentionally being very selective in terms of what he's supporting and why. I really appreciate hearing what's happening there and sharing that with our listeners today.
Thank you so much for your time.